Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is City of Heroes on the Rebirth server with Psyop, our mutation stalker, who's 25th level, and this is Let's Rant with Scrapperlock. We're in about our 20th episode. I didn't actually think I was going to make that many of these. Um, and I wasn't get ready to go on my Christmas vacation. This will probably be posted well after New Year's, but I wasn't going to make another one this week because I'm kind of busy. But I saw a comment on a YouTube video, and I loved this comment. I think I might actually give you a little bit of an excerpt of it because I just think it's absolutely brilliant. So let me pause here while I pull it up. So a guy named Jensen Vars, Vaars, on YouTube has created a video tutorialing his plot unfolding machine. Which, if you like doing solo role-playing games, I can recommend checking out the video. Just Google plot unfolding machine for solo RPG, and you'll find his video. And there's a Foundry mod for it that goes along with Mythic GM emulators. So if you like using Mythic, you can also use the plot unfolding machine. I've not used it myself, but I like the way it looks. I'm currently doing a game, which I'm not posting, using Pathfinder for Savage World and doing Mythic GM emulator just straight the normal way. I've decided when I'm finished with that campaign, however far it goes, the character's currently got 2 advances and is about to get a 3rd advance, I think, if she can save a ranger from being sacrificed as a ritual from some guys for their evil god. When I finish that character, when I decide I've done enough with that character, gets to legendary or whatever, or it dies, I'm going to do something else. I don't know if it's going to be the same setting. I might try some Call of Cthulhu or I don't know what. But I think I'm going to try the plot unfolding machine. It's pretty cool. So that's a little plug for that. I think it's pretty neat. But what I want to talk about is actually a comment, because he's showing here how you can generate stories on the fly with his machine. Here's the scene setup. Is it interrupted? Why was it interrupted? What's the He's got stuff where you can click on a challenge designer and it'll create what's the new challenge, or if it's high stakes and you click that button, or a complication, or a combat, and it'll tell you that the combat is like on a time limit. Why is it on a time limit? You click, reason why, area, it tells you where you're fighting. You can do all kinds of just randomly generate this stuff. And so there's a guy identified on YouTube as Captain Nolan in the comments who writes, in my opinion, DMs are not storytellers. I'm going to excerpt this. I'm not going to say the whole thing. A GM places challenges in front of the players, and the players solve the challenges. And after you're done playing, you can tell the story or the stories about what happened at the table. As a byproduct of play, a story may emerge. The emergent story that we're talking about. And then he goes on to describe the history. And so what he's talking about here, and I can't remember who actually... I can't remember who actually... I can't remember who actually said this in one of the YouTube videos I was watching like a year ago. But he was talking about what he called the forestory, and how did he call it? The forestory and the after story. And let me try to remember how did he call it? The story before and story after is the way he described it. I can't remember who said this. And he said traditionally role-playing games, and this is what this Captain Nolan, please go read his comment. It's a great comment. I'm not going to read the whole thing. What he was talking about is story after, right? And this person, I can't remember who it was that was talking about this contradiction, was talking about story before as well versus story after. And so what I want to do today is talk about story before and story after. This is going to be a little bit of somewhat of a recap and a reprisal of the emergent story video I did, probably 10 episodes ago. But I think this is really important because the Captain Nolan talks about where this came from, story before versus story after. And it's an important piece of role-playing game history. And, even though I lived through it happening, I was not necessarily overtly conscious of the mechanism behind the transition. We've talked about it a little bit with like computer role-playing games and how they changed the hobby and so on. And Captain Nolan talks about that as well. But he makes this amazing point, and I think this is really good, about how D&D is now, and all the role-playing games are now controlled by and run by and written for by professional writers and professional game designers. And he points out that, and I don't know which was which, I'm guessing this is Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax, that the two guys who created Dungeons and Dragons and are the most responsible for the modern role-playing game hobby as we know it today were not professional writers or game designers. One was a shoe salesman and the other one was a security guard. And there's nothing wrong with those professions, of course, but neither of them provides you with any skills related to writing or game design. So what they were coming up with, they had a wargaming background, right? They came from miniatures battles and wargaming, historical reconstructions of battles and stuff like that. This is where they came from. And so the reason they designed the game the way it is, and the reason why all of the early adventures, which we call modules, were designed the way they are, is because these guys weren't professional writers, so they weren't trying to do something like write a novel and turn it into a game. And the person who was, I can't remember who this was that was talking about story before and story after, said that a lot of the people who are writing for role-playing game hobbies today are actually frustrated novelists. What they really want to do is be a novelist. And they can't do it. They aren't publishable, or they haven't written a novel. You know, they would like to write a novel, but they haven't. And so what they do is they take that sort of tendency to write a novel-type story, and they build the whole thing into a D&D adventure that's, 12 levels, and you have a big bad evil guy, and you're supposed to fight him, and you get, Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, or you get, the Tyranny of Dragons. And I don't know whether those particular people are frustrated novelists, but he said the hobby's design side, the people who are designing these games, by and large, are people whose first love is writing stories, not building game adventures. And they take the skills that they use for writing short stories and novels, and they use those skills to build adventures or settings, right? And that's where you get this story before, right? The story of what's going to happen in Out of the Abyss or Tyranny of Dragons or one of these D&D adventures is mostly set by the writers of the module as to what they think would be a cool story, right? And then what you're doing as a player is essentially unlocking the story that was already written for you by a professional writer, right? And this comment by Captain Nolan is that it never would have occurred to Gary Gygax or Dave Arneson to do that because they weren't writers. They were setting up a game adventure, right? So what it occurred to them to do was to create some place for the players to adventure in and some cool stuff for them to do, right? And they recognized that after the adventure, you might have a really awesome story to tell, but they weren't writing the adventure for the purpose of writing, quote-unquote, a story, right? The story came after the play. When the play was done and you were finished role-playing and attacking monsters and getting loot and leveling up and everything else, you had a story to tell that was a lot like a fish story, right? Like you go fishing, and you don't go fishing for the purpose... I think it was the guy who was talking about story before and story after who gave this analogy. You don't go fishing for the purpose of telling a story. You go fishing for the purpose of the activity. You want to be outdoors. You want to be with your buddy on the boat. You want to get the fresh air. You want to maybe catch a fish and have some dinner. And then while you were on the boat trying to catch the fish and having dinner, something amazing happened that happened because you were fishing, right? And it wouldn't have happened if you hadn't been fishing. Maybe you caught the biggest fish ever caught in this river, or maybe the boat capsized and you guys both got soaked, or maybe something else weird happened. You saw a strange animal and you saw a chupacabra. Whatever it happened to be, you're now able to tell the fish story, right? The story of what happened while you were fishing, but you didn't go fishing to tell a story. You went fishing to go fishing. And similarly, so that's story after, right? The fish story came after the activity of fishing, right? And similarly, in a role-playing game, you go into a dungeon and a bunch of cool stuff happens, and after you're done playing, you have a really cool story to tell. My friends and I have that, right? From all the times when we were kids. I have tons of champion stories that I can tell that are really fun. But the question is, Did I write that story ahead of time? Generally, no. Right? It's just I got some villains and we had a battle. Right? The famous. I think I mentioned it. The maybe I have the 12 on 12 battle where I had 12 heroes and 12 villains. Um, that was partly made up on the spot, and the reason in that story I talk about the my friend looking up the stats of Ankylosaur and Wyvern and Firewing. Why was he doing that? Because I pulled them out of enemies. Why did I pull them out of enemies? Because the morning it happened, it was a Saturday, I found out that 2 extra guys were coming, and I needed more villains. I didn't start out saying I'm going to have a 12 on 12. I started out saying we've got 2 superhero groups that some of us play in both, and one guy and a couple of people play in one, right? So my best friend and one of the other guys played in both, and so they had 2 characters to play. And then one of the other guys that played in one group didn't have another, so he was going to play my character as an NPC and his character. So they each had 2 characters to play. But then the one guy who never came said he could show up. And then another guy who didn't play in those groups but wanted to join us with his own individual independent superhero said he wanted to come, right? And all of a sudden I had 6 players when I expected 3 or 4, and I needed more villains, right? So all I knew that was going to happen was that the villains and the heroes were going to have a battle, and that the villains were trying to capture and not kill the heroes, and they were purposely trying to fight heroes because they wanted points for the Great Supervillain Contest. But that's all I knew about that fight ahead of time. I didn't have a story planned. And then the fight began, right? And it ended up taking 2 days, and it was an awesome battle. And like we were reciting the story blow by blow in school the next week to all of our friends who played Champions but weren't there that day, right? To our other friends. And they were like, "Oh, that sounds so cool. I wish I was there." Right? The story came after. Right? It was a situation. It was Champions calls them scenarios, right? It doesn't call them storylines or story arcs like they do here in City of Heroes. In Champions, they called them scenarios, right? A scenario is a situation, right? There are villains robbing a bank, and the heroes get the alarm. Go. That's the way you're supposed to play Champions. So that's the way, at least the way they expected you to play it. And so, yeah, you could have these big epic storylines, and we sometimes built into that. But that was years later, after we had been playing a long time and started seeing the tendency of role-playing games and the computer games to create this story before that you're unlocking, right? So story before is, I already know there's going to be a 12 on 12, and now I have to scare up enough players to do the 12 on 12 because I have this story that I want to happen, and we need 6 players and 12 villains and 12 heroes to do it, right? Versus story after is, well, I expected 4 people to show up and 6 people did, so I pulled a bunch of villains out of thin air and just desperately ran the battle, and it all turned out cool, right? And so, so what this Captain Nolan is talking about is the reason that role-playing games started out as story after is because the original designers, not just Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, but if you go to Steve Peterson and George McDonald, who are the designers of Champions and probably the designers of these other games, weren't professional game designers, because such a thing didn't really exist, certainly for the role-playing hobby, right? Professional game designer, what the heck is that, in 1972? And they weren't professional writers, so they didn't have a writer's sensibility for story structure, climax, denouement, all that stuff. They weren't trying to build an adventure that would give you 3 acts and a build to a climax and then the epilogue, right? The way a good novel or movie would have. They were writing games, right? And so they didn't have those sensibilities, and they weren't trying to force the adventure into a 3-act structure. So it may have had one, but only if it just so happened to be that way after the players were done playing it. And so this Captain Nolan makes this really interesting and I think insightful comment on the Plot Unfolding Machine video, talking about how, I think in praise of the Plot Unfolding Machine, because it's story after, right? It's what happens at the table as you play, right? And versus story before being, I planned it out and now we're unlocking it. And this is where I think a lot of the railroading complaints come from, right? Because if you build the story before, the only way to get the players to go through Act 1 and then Act 2 and then Act 3 and to experience the story lifting to a climax and then the denouement at the end, right? The only way to do that is to force it. You kind of have to railroad at that point because it's not going to happen naturally just by chance, right? In fact, there is a great years ago when I too. So let me bring this up. I talked about players being or DMs or not the adventure designers being frustrated novelists. Well, sometimes players and DMs are. So in my group, we actually, by coincidence, had this conversation 2 days ago in our last session while we were waiting for the one guy who was struggling to get it was my best friend who was struggling to get his audio to work. He was having some problem with his mic, and he kept logging in and logging out and trying to fix it. And while he was doing that, we were just chatting, and the temporary GM who's running the game right now was saying how this campaign that he's doing has been a lot of fun for him because it allows him to exercise his writing desires. And he then said, I always wanted to be a writer, and then I found out how hard it is to do and how much work it takes to do it properly, and I decided not to do it. But I can still get some of that out of my system by being a DM and doing some storytelling that way. And I then said, yeah, I think, I too, I've got a number of unfinished novels. I've got a couple that are finished but not publishable. So I too am a frustrated novelist. And the woman from Finland was saying that she too always wanted to be a novelist, like write fantasy novels and stuff. All three of us were saying that, and I know my best friend. So that's 4 out of the 5 of us. The only person who didn't say she wanted to do that was the new girl, the one who's never played D&D until this, we started a couple years ago. So 4 out of the 5 of us literally are frustrated novelists who wish we could be novelists, right? And I said, I think that may be where, people writing 5-page, these big, long, involved 5-page backgrounds comes from. Because if you take a frustrated novelist and say make up a character, they're going to make up the protagonist for a book because that's what we kind of want to do. And it's very hard to stop yourself from doing it. I kind of did it too when I first came back to the hobby of D&D, right? And I won't do it now because I've thought better of it. And I've done a lot of self-assessment and really thinking hard about what makes these games attractive as games and how they're different from, say, novels. And but it's the case that you have lots of people who are kind of frustrated novelists, and I'm one. And so there was a period in a few years ago when I was trying to get back into writing and try again at, once more into the breach and try again to try my hand at a novel. I was going to do a series of novels. I always chew off far more than I can, bite off far more than I can chew. So I'm not just going to write a short story. I'm going to write a novel. I'm not just going to write one novel. I'm going to write a 5-book series. And again, it's too much, right? But I was reading all this stuff on structure, and of course, they're all telling you got to have 3-act structure and how to build into it and stuff. And then I read this other person who was really funny. He wrote as the Hulk Smash and stuff, but he was critiquing it very, very, very well, this 3-act structure business. And he said 3-act structure, like, the idea of where 3-act structure came from is not like this is how you write a play, right? It's just that whoever first talked about it had, and in Greek tragedies and stuff, had analyzed the existing plays and noted that many of them had this 3-act structure. That doesn't mean you have to do it that way. And in fact, it can be often artificial to force a story into a 3-act structure. And so, again, that's sort of like the story before versus story after. I'm going to force it to be a 3-act structure, and now I'm going to make the story fit that structure, whether it does or not. And what the Hulk was arguing in this blog post where he was criticizing it was, no, write the story as it needs to be written. Put the parts in, the number of acts and parts and scenes that you need, right? And if it happens to be 3-act structure, it's fine. But he pointed out, a lot of Shakespeare's plays are 5 acts. So if Shakespeare himself was doing 5 acts, what makes you think a 3-act structure is the only way to go, right? And so, but that's, again, you have this this idea of planning it out and then forcing it into the structure that you have pre-planned versus allowing it to emerge. And so what happens is professionals start to, once they learn sort of quote unquote the right way to do it, they then feel like this is how you have to do it, and then they're going to try to force everything into that structure. And so, I was caught up in that too because, again, I'm a frustrated novelist. What did I do with my Rome campaign? I started out trying. I mean, I didn't want to railroad the players, but I also wanted to have a good story, right? And I tried to create. I created a story before, and the story was that this evil guy is trying to take down the Roman Empire, and the players are going to stop him. So I didn't want it to be a railroad, but in a very general sense, it was. That is, they couldn't refuse to be about the process of stopping the bad guy from destroying the Roman Empire. That would have ended the campaign because that's what the campaign was about. And when they stopped him, even though they were 13th level and there's a huge world out there and we could potentially have explored it, I said that's the end of the game. Now, I stopped it for other reasons, right? I had wearied of 5th edition, and I certainly didn't want to do the high level play. But even if that hadn't been the case, once they defeated the big bad evil guy, I had nothing left. There was nothing else I was planning to do in that world because I had created a story before and kind of decided what the story was, and they were just essentially unlocking the story, which is, by the way, very much what you're doing in this game, right? What am I doing here? We're on a story arc, and as I complete each mission, I'm unlocking the next part of the story. This is story before, right? Nothing that happens in this happens in response to what my character has done. It's just my character unlocks the different parts of the story as I complete each mission. And so that will create a more organized, structured storyline with the 3-act or 4-act structure, however you're going to do it, with the climax, with the rising action, the climax, and then the falling action at the end, and the satisfying conclusion, and the defeat of the big bad evil guy. Which is why City of Heroes does it. It creates a satisfying story that narratively makes good logical sense, but there's no freedom for the player to contribute to that story, and you're not actually having a story happen. You're just unlocking it. The story was already written before you ever stepped foot in the first instance mission. And so that's story before, right? And what this Captain Nolan points out is that came because professional writers started being hired, like Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman started being hired by TSR and the other companies to write adventures. They were trying to make better adventures, and they thought they messed up in a way because they thought that because we tell stories after the game that we need to tell better stories, right? It'll be a better game if we tell better stories. And so they thought, well, to tell better stories, we need storytellers. We need writers, professional storytellers, to write the stories that the players can then play and tell each other. But what ends up happening is then we all play Descent into Avernus, and we all tell the same story, or a very similar story, because it's all kind of locked in. And it takes a lot of freedom. I don't want to say agency, but freedom away from both the GM and the player if you lock in the story ahead of time. So I'm going to say my big mistake in Rome, by the way, wasn't just doing story before. I think that was a mistake. But it was I did story before, but I didn't want to railroad my players, so I gave them a lot of options, right? So the way I did characterize it to them is there's a world story, which is the story of Magog, the evil guy who's trying to, destroy the Roman Empire. And I planned that out. That was a locked story. He was going to do steps. I wrote out the steps he had to take, the cities he had to conquer, the information he needed to gather. It was a spreadsheet. And I used the map to calculate how long it would take his armies and how long it would take him to move around the map. And I just had a series of checkpoints. And as the calendar advanced, the character started hearing news of him going around the Roman Empire doing shit, right? And they, at first they didn't hear anything. And then as time went on, they started realizing one city fell, then another city. They started realizing this guy's going to keep doing this until we stop him. And that created a great sense of urgency, which they liked, okay? But that story was pre-written. And what I had was, this is what will happen if the players don't interfere, right? And then at any point, they could fix it or solve it by interfering and stopping him. And at some point, I knew it would come to a head and they would have to kill him and save him. And there was only really one way to do it. They had to kill him and then wish, because he was a revenant, cast a wish that would free him from his need for revenge and give him peace. And I think they actually liked doing it at the end. He sort of nodded in thanks to them and that sort of stuff. But here's the problem with that. What if they didn't want to use the wish? I mean, for instance, I had to ban the wish spell. Why? Because it would have broken the story. Right? Now, I also don't happen to like the way the wish spell is done in 5th edition, but so that gave me an excuse. But the reason I banned wish was because it would break the story. Because the only way that I had decided that they were going to be able to win wasn't to kill him, but to kill him and then use a wish to free him. And I didn't want them to have many wishes accessible to them so that they could just use one of them. So I banned the wish spell so they couldn't take it. So I thought they would be 20th level and not 13th when they finished, and they might be able to take it. And then I created a magical artifact that was the only artifact in the world that could wish. And it had one wish, and it had to be a selfless wish. Right? And so the idea was if they do a selfless wish to help a person who was an enemy of theirs know peace, which is a very selfless and sort of turn the other cheek kind of a thing, right? That if they would do that, they would win the scenario, right? Can they be noble? This is all very artificial, right? And although the individual adventures weren't railroady, that plot is a railroad, and you can't win any other way. I would not do it that way again, right? Why did I do it that way? Because I was thinking story before. I thought I have to write. My best friend I knew, wanted an epic, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings type story, and I wanted to give him one. And the new player had never played, and I wanted to give her one and let her see what an epic story in D&D could be like. But the thing is, it's not epic because you made it that way ahead of time. It's epic because you had epic fun and awesome things happen during the game. And what I saw as we were playing is the most epic, the most memorable stuff happened when I didn't plan it. The stuff that I didn't plan ended up being cooler than the stuff I did plan. The stories we told after about the stuff that was a total surprise were way better than the ones that I planned out ahead of time. And that is why over the last couple of years, I have come to be a big proponent of story after rather than story before. It's not just some sort of a hypothetical thing. I saw it happen. I also saw, for instance, my best friend, who made up a bunch of stuff for his character, right? He boxed himself in. He's a frustrated novelist. His character, Hassan, was based on a character named Chance, who was a superhero of his who could alter probabilities, basically a clone of Scarlet Witch, although he probably wouldn't want to admit that. He can alter probabilities to make the impossible possible and the likely impossible and so on. And he created it in Champions, and he's created it a couple of times in Neverwinter Nights and Divinity Original Sin and D&D. And he's never been able to really get the character to work the way he's imagining. And he told me at one point, and I didn't know this until a few years ago, that what he really wanted to do was play out the character enough until he'd worked out enough of his ideas so that he could, guess what, write a novel about this character. So he came into my campaign with this huge story before, this big giant backstory that was incredibly inflexible, that didn't really fit into the Roman game, that was the original story he'd written, I guess, for this backstory he'd written for this novel, right? And just with the proper names changed to the cities of the Roman Empire. His character really didn't fit, and it really was designed more to be the protagonist of a novel. And I didn't completely clock it because it was just a background at that point. I certainly recognized he hadn't done much to fit into my world. I knew at this point that it was a character that he really wanted to play and write a novel about. So I was trying to make it happen for him so that he could work out his ideas and eventually write his novel someday, because I'd love to read it. So I kind of realized what was happening, but not entirely. I should have nixed this background. I should have said, this doesn't work because you're writing story before. I think at one point I said Luke Hart described this as a self-railroad. That's what it is, right? He wrote the story of his character, a big chunk of it, before, and then what he was trying to do with his own roleplay experience in my campaign was unlock the story before that he'd written, which is very similar to what I was doing with the overall plot. So here we had him doing story before with his character, and me doing a world plot separately. We bring them together, and then we were both frustrated. He was frustrated that I almost never was able to bring his character stuff into the game because his story before didn't match mine, and I was frustrated that he kept making me add this stuff that didn't match my story before. And neither of us would have had this problem if we had been both doing story after. Just start and play. The other players, right, like the cleric player, I remember him specifically saying he did a very short backstory. It wasn't very involved. At some point, they asked him about his character, and he said, I don't know. I'm still discovering Cleek, which was the name of his character. I'm still discovering who he is as a character. He was the best character in the group, in my opinion, because that player did story after, right? He came up with stuff as we went. We got these in-jokes and stuff, more about his character than the others, because he was doing story after. He came up with the story in play based on what was going on, and after the play was over, we had a story to tell about his character. And he wasn't trying to fit that character into a preconceived story ahead of time the way my best friend was doing, and the way I was doing with the world. So one of the things I now realize that I did that I really screwed up was because I started out thinking story before, just like my best friend did, and I would say he screwed this up too. I don't know if he'll admit it, but I would say it for sure. After doing that and setting it up, I then started watching these videos and reading posts by people like Luke Hart and Seth Skorkowski and Matt Colville, essentially talking about how much easier it is to do story after. Now, they didn't call it that, but West Marches, the emergent plot, Professor Dungeon Master talks about this, Trevor Duvall talks about this, and in fact, Captain Nolan links both Trevor talking about how the Dungeon Master is not a storyteller in response to Dungeon Craft, and the Dungeon Craft channel talking about how the DM shouldn't be a storyteller, right? You're setting up a game. I started watching these afterwards, and I started trying to make the individual adventures be more story after. But it was already too late because I had set the world plot as story before, right? And so now I had this, like, maybe the worst case scenario of a weird, like, chimeric hybrid, right? This sort of mixed, hybridized beast that was part story before and part story after. And we had a party where the one player was all story before and the other players are story after. And I think that made it much more awkward to piece everything together than it would have otherwise been. And I didn't really clock that was happening while it was happening. It was only sort of months later, like when we stopped and played Candlekeep for 6 months, and I had time to step back from my campaign to see what was happening. That's when I realized what was going on, and at that point, it was pretty much too late to fix much of it, But that's when I kind of figured out and clocked what was going on, and so yeah, I think that I don't know if this is really a rant. I'm just sort of talking about, in theory, which way works. I mean, that's up to you. And some people like story before. But Captain Nolan's point is the game was designed for story after. And it was designed that way because the people who designed it weren't storytellers on a professional level. They weren't writers. And so they weren't trying to make a 3-act play. They were trying to write a dungeon you could adventure in. And you just told stories that were cool after you came home from the dungeon, right? And I definitely think that there's a lot to that method, and I feel like there's a lot of wisdom to that, but that explains sort of, it's one thing to say that's how it used to be, but his explanation tells us why, right? That the reason it's all story-based now is because you have professional storytellers trying to use their storytelling skills to make missions and adventures and campaigns and stuff like that. Whereas when Gary Gygax was doing it, and Dave Arneson and these early guys, Tom Moldvay, they were not professional novelists or writers. They they had other jobs, and then they got into games as a side piece, a side gig, and then maybe they made a living at it, and they became professional D&D designers, but they didn't come from a writing, storytelling type of background. And so that is a really interesting comment, and I think it's very important to kind of remember that. It's important to think about like the lineage of where the games you're playing comes from, so you can understand why they did the things they did, right? So some of the things that seem utterly baffling, we understand. So if you think about adventures, right, in modern day 5th edition, we still call the adventures in the vernacular modules, right? These are the published hardcover books that DMs can use to run games, right? They're not really adventures. I've said this before. They're campaign. When you go from level 1 to 15 in 4 or 5 different dungeons, you're not going on an adventure. That's a campaign, right? A campaign. Why do we call it that, by the way? Why is it called a campaign? Why isn't it called a story arc, like they do in City of Heroes? It's called a campaign. Why? Well, because Gary Gygax came from a wargaming background, right? And in the military, right, individual battles are part of a larger strategy that you have to take an area or defeat an enemy, and they call them a campaign, right? Like the Africa campaign, in which the Allies were slowly going back and taking Africa away from the Nazis, right? And so that's why Gygax called it a campaign, right? Because a campaign was a series of adventures that happened one after another, and when you're done, you've completed something, right? Your characters are high level, they're lords now, and they've got a stronghold. And so that's why it's called a campaign, right? And so anyway, by the normal definition of a role-playing campaign, things like Out of the Abyss and Descent into Avernus and Storm King's Thunder are campaigns, right? They're a series of adventures that are all connected to each other in some sort of a narrative way, and you play them one after another until you finish the storyline. And so these books that are published are campaigns of adventures, and the individual adventures are all bundled in the book, and they're certainly not going to be easy to pull out of there and use somewhere else, right? How did they do it in the 1970s? They had modules, right? They called them modules. Now, in the vernacular, these big, thick books that are campaigns are called modules by the people who buy them. I bought the Descent into Avernus module, or the Tyranny of Dragons module. But it's not a module, because modules were short. They were 30 pages. They had a couple of maps. And most modules, if you go back and look, they're maps and a map key of what's in each place on the map. And then how that all fits together into some kind of an adventure is up to the GM to determine. I remember reading Village of Hamlet the first time and going, what's the adventure? Like, it doesn't tell you. It's just like, here's the village, here are all the people in the village, and over here's a moat house with some bandits and monsters in it. And it's near the village. And there's absolutely nothing in the text that tells you why a party of adventurers that happen to be in Hamlet would want to go to the dungeon to adventure. Why not? Well, because first of all, Gary Gygax assumed you're playing D&D. You know, nobody needs to give you a reason to roll the dice and move the pieces in Monopoly. Why would I need to give you a reason to go to a dungeon? Aren't you playing D&D? There's a dungeon. It's Dungeons and Dragons. Go to the dungeon, right? And so they didn't think they needed to give you a reason. But also, there was no story before, right? So when I was reading The Village of Hamlet, this was like in the late 80s, I was reading it going, where's the story? I was looking for the story before. It wasn't there, because the guy who wrote it wasn't a writer. So he didn't create a story before. He was a dungeon designer, so he just designed a dungeon and a city. And assumed that the players or the GM would come up with a reason to go there. There's a dungeon over there. Let's go see what's there. A story will emerge out of that, right? And this is true for many of the Caves of Chaos, right? All they give you in the Keep on the Borderlands is that there are these monsters over there in this cave, and they're causing trouble in the surrounding area, and the assumption is the players will go beat up the monsters so they stop causing trouble. And there's really no particular reason to go and kill every monster in the Caves of Chaos, except that's what you do in D&D, right? As opposed to if you read something like Storm King's Thunder or, you know, Horde of the Dragon Queen or something like that, there's going to be a big story, there's going to be a narrative, there's going to be a plot, right? So we called them modules before because they were little tiny things that were just maps and map keys with maybe a possible plot hook for why you would go into the dungeon. Very short, simple, and obvious. There's treasure here, right? There's an evil guy here, and he's got a big treasure, so let's go get it. And then they would just let you just go and play in the world, right? And play in the dungeon. Whereas now you get these, 200-page tomes that go from level 1 to level 15, and they're building to a climax. And I'm sure it can be really cool when you get it to work properly. But as Luke Hart has pointed out, many of them are crazy. Like the Princes of the Apocalypse, he said it's 4 dungeons. But the way they expect you to adventure in the dungeons, it's like each dungeon has, say, 3 levels deep, I think. And so you're supposed to go through the dungeons in order. So the first dungeon, you do the first level of it, and that's for level 1 or 2 adventurers. And then the second level, the second dungeon, you don't go down in the dungeon, you go over to the second dungeon, and you do the top level of that one. And that's for level 3 and 4. And then you go over to the third dungeon, and that's for level 4 and 5, top level. And then the fourth dungeon, top level. And then you come back to the first dungeon and do the second level. And then back to the next dungeon and do the second level. And then you rotate around, and then you rotate around and do the third level. And he said his players got so frustrated because it's not natural to do that. The natural thing to do is go downstairs and do this dungeon and then go to the next one. And they went down, and all of a sudden they go from first and second level monsters to sixth level monsters, and they had to run. Like, this is way too hard. They tried to go back. It's still way too hard. So they ran from that dungeon. Let's go to the next dungeon. Oh, it makes sense again. They go down to the second level, frustrated again. So they finally said to him, look, could you just tell us the order we're supposed to do these? Let's just break the fourth wall because this is really frustrating. And he told them. And when he told them the order, they're like, that's stupid. Why would they write it that way? And he said, I don't know. So one of the things he said to dungeon masters who want to run Princes of the Apocalypse is fix that. You are going to need to go in there and redo that. So I don't know the dungeons, but what I would probably do is take the top level, the first 3 dungeon top levels and put them together as one dungeon. I don't know if you can do that because the dungeons are supposed to be about the 4 different elements. So you can't necessarily move fire into water and stuff. So I'm not sure how easy that would be to do. But it didn't make any sense, right? So the writer of the story of Princes of the Apocalypse thought it would make sense to do the dungeons one layer at a time and rotate through them, and wrote a story that would build to a climax assuming the players did that. And then if the players don't do that, you have a mess, right? That's story before. So the thing with story before is you need the players to cooperate organically or to ask, what are we supposed to do here? Which is super frustrating. Well, City of Heroes has that, right? I'm cooperating. What do I do? I go to the contact. What am I supposed to do here, Marvin? What am I supposed to do here? Tell me. What do I do next? Freak Olympics. Okay. That's what we'll go do. You can have a perfectly fun game session doing that, but it's going to be a very different experience for players than the story after. And so I think this is, I just love this guy's comment, so I urge you to go and read the whole thing. It's really cool. I'm going to read a little bit of it. The story is what happens at or away from the table after the game is finished for the evening, when tales are told of what happened. When I hear GMs and game designers talking about 3-act structure overlaid by the Shakespearean 5-act structure, and then talking about the realization moment of screenplays coming at approximately page 80 and the climax of the story, and heaven help us, the denouement, right, which I've been talking about, I know I'm listening to someone who likely learned to play after the rise of storytelling. And so the thing is, it's almost impossible to get organic gameplay to happen at the table when you're trying to impose that rigid of a story structure into your game. It's very hard. And I saw this happen with my game, right? And I think that the climax was probably weaker than it could have been because I had decided what it was going to be ahead of time and then tried to build to it without forcing them, which is so hard to do. And I know, for instance, my best friend who had done his story before, he was constantly being frustrated by my lack of organically generating stuff for his character to do based on his interests throughout the campaign. I had spots where I did it in isolation to kind of satisfy him or pacify him or scratch the itch for him. But when his character found out that he was the heir to the throne of Egypt, the natural thing for him to do was I want to go to Egypt with my mother, free them, and take the throne. I had no way of doing that. That wasn't what the story was about, because I had written the world story before I saw his background, and it didn't fit. This other guy, John, who I've talked about, who's read what I wrote to him and said, I don't want to play in your world. Here's what I suspect happened. He thought Rome sounded cool. He made up a Ben-Hur kind of a character who was a Jewish character who had been sort of become enamored of the Roman Empire and turned against his own people. And I suspect he was probably hoping to have, this is again story before, a Ben-Hur moment where he would have a realization that he had betrayed his own people during play, right? And he would have liked that sort of a moment, but my world did not have Judeo-Christianity in it. And when I wrote him back and said there's no Judeo-Christianity in my world, you're going to have to be like an Egyptian character worshiping Egyptian gods, and then you can do most of the rest of your story. I thought that was a perfectly good compromise because he could still do 90% of his background. He bailed out. And why? Here's why I think he bailed out. I'm guessing, because he didn't say why. He probably said, this GM is doing story before, right? I'm sure he didn't use those terms, but he realized I've already planned out the story, and what he wrote in his background doesn't fit, and I rejected it because of that. If instead I had said, give me your characters and then I'll build the world, I could have built a Judeo-Christian aesthetic in Rome. Would have been easy to do, right? But because I had already created the story before, with the Titans and the betrayal of the Roman Empire toward the Dragonborn and the last Dragonborn Revenant trying to get revenge, because I had built that story before, I couldn't admit a two different backstory that added elements that my world wasn't ready for. Now, I'm not saying when you build a world that you shouldn't have some defined ideas, and if a player violates those defined ideas, you can't say, you can't fit into this, right? We're doing a low magic world, sorry, you can't have this high magic character. That's different, right? But I think that, what I did wasn't just story before, right? I had a cosmology. And you can do that without creating story before, it's just the background. And he didn't fit into the cosmology. That's maybe a different story. But the reason it was a big deal that he didn't fit into the cosmology was because the cosmology was part of the world story. It's not just in the background. The villain was a servant of the Titans, and the Titans had to be the power in the universe that the Roman gods had supplanted. And there couldn't be another god outside of those pantheons. And I already told the players that the Egyptian and the Greek and the Celtic and the Norse gods are all worshipped in this world, but they're basically alter egos of the Roman gods. So Apollo is Horus, and Jupiter is Zeus, is Odin, is the Dagda, right? So they're all the same person. So there aren't multiple pantheons. Therefore, I couldn't have another god off on the other side somewhere being the Judeo-Christian version of the divinity, right? Because that would have screwed with my world. But the reason I did that was because I had a plot I was trying to do based on those gods, right? And it would have broken things if there were too many other gods in the system to vie for power. And so this is how story before can mess things up. My best friend didn't have as good a time with his character as he would have if I had been doing story after. Now, I will say in my defense that my best friend asked for story before in session 0. I offered, again, without using the term story before and story after, I offered 2 campaigns. One, which is sort of a Points of Light and Enter Your Veil type campaign from 4th edition, that style, where I would organically build the world based on what they said they wanted to do. I said, you give me your starting races, and those will be the races in the starting region. So you make a gnome, halfling, dwarf, and humans. There'll be a human city with a dwarven mine in the mountains, and gnomes in the forest, and halflings in the hills. And that's how we'll start. Whatever you tell me you want to start with, I'll put that into the world, right? And then I'll give you a few ideas of places you can go, some on the map and some off the map, and you tell me where you want to go. And when you want to go off the map, then I'll build the next part of the map. And he absolutely rejected that and said, no, 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 no. You should create the story of the world. And we should discover it. It should be there already. Okay? So he asked for story before, right? And then he became frustrated because the story before straitjacketed me in terms of what I could do with his character, right? So my lesson learned from this is I'm not offering story before. We're going to have this conversation in session 0, and I'm going to say, if I GM for you guys, whatever the setting, whatever the game, we're doing story after. Because that's what allows me to be nimble and respond to player desires. And when you create story before, it locks you in. Now, some GMs may be able to create story before and remain nimble. I was not. I found that out about myself. And I became increasingly frustrated that I wanted to be nimble and I couldn't. Couldn't do it and still keep the story going that I was trying to tell. And of course, it was all wrapped up in frustrations with D&D and wanting to switch games. And there's a lot that went into it. But I think that you need to be aware of what you're doing. And again, we've talked about session 0. Have this conversation with your players at session 0. Do we want to be a story before group or a story after group? And we recognize that if we agree to be story before, there will be some sort of railroading. Because what we're saying is we want to have that narrative organized, classical story structure building to a typical climax of a movie. And in order to do that, the GM's going to have to railroad you, or at least linear adventure, right? It might not be a railroad, but it's got to be linear, because that's the only way you can build to a solid climax. If you're scattering all over the place and you're wandering everywhere and you're doing a bunch of different quests, how can you build to a single climax? A plot, when they draw the plot going up, like it's a line graph, guys. Line, linear. You're forcing yourself to have a linear adventure. And that's fine. Linear can be fun. And a railroad can be awesome, right? One of the GMs at one point said, a roller coaster is technically a railroad. And they're super exciting, and people pay a lot of money to go on them, and they're a lot of fun. You can have a really exciting railroad. But if you're going to do that, be aware of what you're doing. So I would say this is another thing to talk about during session 0. Big picture. Do we want to have story before or story after? And let's all agree to it. And if we're doing story after, then that means people can't bring 5-page backstories, because that's story before, right? You can't say, here are all the things I want to happen to my character between now and level 20. That's story before. You have to come to the table with your character and see what happens, right? That's story after. So hopefully this has been informative. I really like that comment. Again, I urge you to go read it, because it's packed with really interesting summary of the history and how D&D and other role-playing games like Champions started out being produced by non-writers, and because of that, they weren't designed to be storytelling games initially. They were designed to be games that you told stories about afterwards. And now people are using them to tell a story explicitly for the purpose, right? So instead of saying we're getting together to play a game, and when we're done with the game, we'll tell a story about it, they're saying we're getting together to tell a story, and we're going to use the game to do it. And both of those are okay to do, but you got to make sure you know what you're doing and why, and everybody's got to be on board with what you're doing, or you're going to end up at loggerheads and frustrate each other, which is what happened in my group a little bit. Now, we mostly had fun, and I don't think anybody was super frustrated, but we did come to loggerheads a couple of times because we some of us wanted story after, some of us wanted story before, and I made it worse, I think, because I started out story before and switched to story after partway through. There was a gut instinct I had when I was talking about the Points of Light versus the Rome game and offering these two campaigns to the players, and they went with the story before, and I had done more work on the Rome world, and I love the Roman Empire. I just think it's a cool it's a cool part of history, and I was excited to do that, and I thought it would be a really cool story, so I was excited by that story before. But there was a little part of me, in the back of my mind, I was like, maybe we really should be doing this, even Rome, as sort of a story after, as sort of organic. Maybe I shouldn't do this world plot. But my best friend was so insistent that he wanted one, and the other players agreed. I thought, all right, I'll do it. And then I got into it, and I was more comfortable doing that because story before is made more sense to me, right? I hadn't played story after since the early 80s. But as we got into it, more and more I said, oh man, I should have done this as more of a story after. And lessons learned. So learn the lesson from what I did. Definitely talk with your players about it, and I would say don't try to switch in the middle because that became my desire, and like I tried to do it a little bit, and like that doesn't work at all. So yeah, learn some lessons from those of us who've done it the wrong way, and definitely talk with each other in your session zero, and maybe even before. I mean, I feel like session zero is too late. If you're going to be making up characters and stuff, you need to know when you arrive. Are we making up characters cold, or are we bringing backstories and story before to the table? As long as you agree, I think it can be a lot of fun either way. But for me, for my money, my money's on story after. Now, I expect my best friend when he runs his game is going to do story before, and I can live with that. But he's going to be frustrated by me and the new girl because we're both saying, no, we're not going to build big long backstories. We're going to do story after. So that's something we definitely need to talk about. I hope we'll have a session zero, and he'll give me a chance to talk about that because I'll bring it up at least and say, look, this is my interest at this point. And I want to put huge props to Sean Tompkin, creator of Ironsworn and Starforged. Although I'm not playing those games anymore, playing those games solo helped me see the power of story after. I created some really cool stories by just rolling dice, seeing what they said, and then coming up with a story based on what the dice say. And I surprised myself, and I came up with really cool things I never would have thought to do if I created this story myself on paper. And I think that my Roman game was very predictable. I think in the end, like I hit a lot of stuff from them with mysteries, but I think by the end, they probably would have said it was pretty predictable. They knew it was going to happen at the end. They were pretty much checking the boxes. And I think the reason is that I didn't randomly roll for that stuff. I did what came out of my head, which is very conventional and very methodical and very logical because I'm a scientist and this is how I think. And I think back to like even my novels. The one novel I wrote, I remember one of my good friends read it. The guy who's the best GM, his name's Rob, and he wrote back and said it's pretty good, but it like nothing surprised him. Everything was so obvious what was going to happen next. So then I tried to make some changes, and I had another friend read it and said, "Do me a favor at the end of each chapter, predict what you think is going to happen next, and write it down, so that you don't change it after you read it because that's what happens. We do with our mind." And it wasn't. It was less predictable, I guess, because he didn't always predict everything. But he did that for me, which is super helpful. But again, I saw it's too predictable, and because I'm too logical, right? And the fate chart or the random roll helps you generate something you wouldn't have thought of that is cool and different and surprising. And so I think I'm not going to like roll the fate chart at the table. I can't. I'm not that nimble, but I will do stuff like you maybe use the fate chart and say, all right, the scene that's supposed to happen here is going to be this next week. Let's roll and see if it gets interrupted. And if it gets interrupted, let's randomly see what it is. Oh, it's this, right? So I might offline be privately keeping the fate chart and all that stuff from Mythic as like a little GM aid and just like taking notes on it and stuff and random rolling and then having stuff happen that would be surprising, right? And it'll all be generated dynamically story after rather than trying to come up with it ahead of time. So anyway, uh, lessons learned, and hopefully that will help people who are thinking about what to do for their next GM campaign, for their next D&D or Starfinder or whatever campaign. And until next time, I am Scrapper Lock, and this has been City of Heroes. Let's rant with Scrapper.